There's a name that appears 17 times in plantation ledgers across Tidewater, Virginia between 1839 and 1847, always in the margins, always in different handwriting, as if no one wanted to claim ownership of what was written. The entries describe a man who returned 94 escaped slaves to bondage with a success rate that made professional patrollers look like amateurs. What makes these records disturbing isn't just the numbers. It's that this hunter was himself enslaved, purchased specifically for this purpose, and the methods he used were so effective that plantation owners began hiding the documents, afraid of what questions they might raise. County clerks in 5 different Virginia jurisdictions filed complaints about irregularities in bounty payments, but every investigation was quietly closed within weeks. The most chilling detail: in 1846, 3 separate witnesses reported seeing him weeping while dragging a family back in chains. Before we continue with the story of the man they called Solomon Crowe, I need you to do something. If you're listening from anywhere in the United States, leave a comment telling me what state or city you're from. I want to know how far these dark chapters of American history reach. And hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear has been buried in courthouse basement and private collections for nearly 2 centuries. What the ledgers don't show, what no official record could capture, is how Solomon Crowe became the instrument of his own people's destruction, and why the truth of his story was more terrible than anyone could have imagined. The Tidewater region of Virginia in 1839 was a landscape of contradictions where the old plantation aristocracy struggled to maintain their grip on a way of life that was slowly choking itself to death. The soil was depleted from 2 centuries of tobacco cultivation, and many once grand estates had fallen into Gentile decay, their column facades hiding rot and debt. Towns like Petersburg and Suffolk had become waypoints on the Underground Railroad, their proximity to the North Carolina border and the Great Dismal Swamp making them focal points in the eternal chess game between freedom and captivity. The Fairmont estate, 12 miles south of Petersburg, exemplified this decline. Its master, Richard Fairmont, had inherited 0 acres and 187 enslaved people from his father, along with debts that grew like kudzu. Unlike the methodical cruelty of some planters, Fairmont's evil was bureaucratic. He saw human beings as assets to be maximized, and when those assets fled toward freedom, he saw it as theft. By 1838, he had lost 19 people to escape in just 14 months. Each disappearance draining his resources further. Professional slave catchers demanded fees he could barely afford, and their success rate was mediocre at best. The Great Dismal Swamp, that vast wilderness of cypress and black water stretching across the Virginia border, swallowed fugitives like a protective beast. It was during a forced auction of surplus property in Richmond that Fairmont encountered something unusual. Among the lots being sold from a bankrupt estate near Norfolk was a man listed simply as Solomon, approximately 30 years old, with a notation that made Fairmont lean forward in his seat. Exceptional tracking ability, previously employed in specialized recovery operations, literate, speaks multiple dialects, cooperative disposition. Solomon Crowe stood on that auction block with his eyes fixed on the middle distance, his face a mask that revealed nothing. He was tall and lean, with hands that showed calluses from fieldwork, but also an unusual delicacy in the fingers, the hands of someone who had done more than just swing a hoe. When Fairmont's agent approached to examine him, Solomon answered questions in a voice that was neither defiant nor servile, but matter of fact. Yes, he could read and write. Yes, he had experienced tracking through swampland. Yes, he understood the routes typically used by runaways. His previous owner, he explained with no visible emotion, had used him to recover property before financial collapse forced the sale. Fairmont paid $1,200, 3 times the going rate for a field hand, and brought Solomon to the Fairmont estate with specific instructions. He would be housed separately from the other enslaved people, given better rations, and promised that his own wife and 2 children, currently held on a neighboring plantation, would be purchased and brought to Fairmont within a year if his performance proved satisfactory. The bargain was explicit. Bring back those who fled and your family would be reunited fail, and they would be sold down river to the sugar plantations of Louisiana, where the average life expectancy was 7 years. What Fairmont didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Solomon Crowe had been born free in Delaware, the son of a freedman carpenter. At age 12, he had been kidnapped by professional slave stealers while visiting relatives in Maryland. His free papers destroyed, his identity erased. For 18 years, he had survived by making himself invaluable by learning every skill that might keep him from the fields by studying the psychology of both the enslaved and the enslaver. He had learned to track not because he wanted to, but because a previous master had given him a choice. Use your intelligence to serve me or watch me sell your family piece by piece. He had chosen to serve. He had chosen to survive, and in doing so, he had become something he despised. The other enslaved people at Fairmont watched Solomon's arrival with weary eyes. Word traveled fast in the quarters, and his reputation had preceded him. Here was a man who hunted his own people. Here was a traitor, a collaborator, a soul who had sold himself so completely that he had become the master's hand. They didn't know about his family held hostage. They didn't know about the nights he lay awake, cataloging every compromise, every betrayal, every time he had chosen his children's survival over another person's freedom. They only saw what he did, not why he did it. Within the slave quarters, a quiet resistance had been building. A woman named Celia, who worked in the main house and had access to information, ran a careful network, passing messages about escape routes and timing. A blacksmith named Abel had been stockpiling tools and supplies, hiding them in the root cellar of an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. They had helped 11 people reach freedom in the past year, and they were planning their own escape. A coordinated departure of 8 people who would move as a group, too many for the local patrollers to easily handle. Solomon's arrival threatened everything, but he gave no sign of knowing about their plans. He kept to himself, speaking little, his eyes always seeming to look past people rather than at them. Fairmont gave him a horse, a rifle, and a bloodhound named Judge, tools of the hunt. The dog at least seemed to sense something wrong about the arrangement. It obeyed Solomon's commands, but never warmed to him, never wagged its tail, as if it understood the moral corruption of its purpose. 3 weeks after Solomon's arrival, a young man named Marcus disappeared. He had been working in the tobacco fields when he suddenly collapsed, clutching his stomach. The overseer, annoyed at the interruption, had him dragged to the sick house. That night, Marcus vanished. By dawn, when his absence was discovered, he had an 8-hour head start, enough time to reach the edge of the Dismal Swamp if he moved fast and smart. Fairmont summoned Solomon to the main house. The other enslaved people watched from a distance as the tall man listened to his instructions, nodded once, and walked to the stable where Judge was kept. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't need to. Everyone knew what was about to happen. Solomon Crowe rode out as the sun broke through the morning mist, following the trajectory of a man who had chosen death over bondage. The trail Marcus left was careful at first, walking in stream beds to hide his scent, moving through dense underbrush where tracks would be harder to spot. But fear makes people careless eventually, and Solomon found the signs he knew would be there. A broken branch at shoulder height where someone had pushed through too quickly, a partial footprint in soft mud near a creek crossing, disturbed leaf litter where someone had stopped to rest. Judge the bloodhound pulled against the lead, nose to the ground, following a scent trail that was still fresh. Solomon let the dog work, his face expressionless, his mind somewhere else entirely. He was thinking about his daughter Mercy, who would be 9 years old now, and his son Isaac, who would be 7. He was thinking about his wife Hannah, who had looked at him with something between love and horror the last time he'd seen her 2 years ago, when he'd been forced to bring back a pregnant woman who had been hiding in her owner's barn. Hannah had asked him then, "How do you live with yourself?" He hadn't had an answer. He still didn't. The trail led northeast toward the Nahway River, and beyond it, the vast darkness of the Dismal Swamp. Marcus was heading for the Maroon community, the settlement of permanent runaways who had built a hidden world in the swamp's interior, living on high ground amid the cypress and black water, too deep for casual pursuit. If he reached them, he would effectively disappear. The Maroons protected their own, and the swamp protected the Maroons. It was a good plan, except for one thing. Solomon knew exactly where the Maroon settlements were. His previous master had forced him to memorize every path, every landing, every island of firm ground where fugitives might find shelter. By midday, Solomon had closed the distance. He could see fresh tracks now, pressed deep into mud. Marcus was tiring, moving less carefully. The scent trail was so strong that Judge barely needed the lead anymore. They were perhaps an hour behind now, maybe less. The landscape had changed, becoming wetter, the trees draped with Spanish moss, the air thick with the smell of decay and stagnant water. They were entering the periphery of the swamp, and then Solomon did something that would have confused anyone watching. He stopped. He tied Judge to a tree, the dog whining in protest. He sat down on a fallen log and opened the small pack he carried. Inside was hardtack, dried meat, a compass, and a small leather journal. He opened the journal, a forbidden item, a death sentence if discovered, and wrote a single sentence. Marcus Pembry, tobacco field worker, Fairmont Estate, headed for dismal interior, strong runner, deserved better. He had entries for every person he'd tracked, 93 names before this one, 93 small monuments to his own damnation. He closed the journal, put it away, and sat for another 15 minutes, listening to the sounds of the swamp, the distant call of a heron, the rustle of wind through cypress leaves, the soft complaint of the bloodhound wanting to continue the hunt. Then he stood untied Judge and kept moving because he had made a choice years ago, and he lived with that choice every single day. His children or someone else's freedom, his family's survival or his own soul. He had chosen, and he would keep choosing until something finally broke inside him, or the world changed enough that such choices were no longer necessary. He found Marcus as the sun began its descent, caught in a moment of rest on a small island of solid ground surrounded by black water. The young man saw Solomon approaching and didn't run. There was nowhere left to run. His face showed exhaustion and resignation, but also a kind of dignity. He had tried, and that meant something even in failure. "Please," Marcus said, his voice, "just let me go into the water. Tell them you never found me." "You know what happens when they bring us back." Solomon dismounted, Judge growling softly at his side. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost lost in the swamp sounds, he replied, "I can't. They have my children." Marcus's face shifted from anger to something more complex. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. Here was a man trapped by the same system, forced to be its instrument. "What are their names?" he asked. "Mercy and Isaac." Solomon's voice was steady, but something in his eyes wasn't. 8 and 7. "I haven't seen them in 2 years, and you think bringing me back in chains will get them back to you? I think if I don't, they'll be sold to Louisiana, and I'll never see them alive again. I think the world is a machine designed to crush us in every way possible, and all we can do is choose which part of ourselves we lose. I chose. The silence between them was heavy with all the things that couldn't be said, all the small murders that survival required. Finally, Marcus extended his hands for the rope. "Then do what you have to do, but know that every one of us in those quarters knows what you are. You might save your children, Solomon Crowe, but you'll die alone, and no one will mourn you." Solomon bound his hands, the rope tight, but not cruel, his movements mechanical. "I know," he said. "I've known that for years." They rode back toward Fairmont as darkness fell. Judge trotting alongside, Marcus walking with his hands bound. Solomon mounted, but looking like he was the one in chains. Behind them, the Dismal Swamp faded into the night, its secrets intact, its dark water reflecting nothing. When they arrived at Fairmont Estate just before midnight, the overseer and 2 field hands were waiting with torches. They took Marcus roughly, already discussing his punishment, a whipping certainly to discourage others, and possibly the sale of family members, if he had any, to break his spirit completely. Solomon handed over the rope and turned to lead his horse to the stable without a word. Fairmont himself emerged from the main house in his nightshirt, satisfied and already calculating the money saved by not hiring professional catchers. But someone else was watching too. From the window of the quarters, Celia saw it all. Their return, the handover, the casual efficiency of betrayal, and she understood that everything had changed. Their planned escape just 2 weeks away would have to be accelerated or abandoned, because now there was a hunter among them who knew the old routes, who understood the patterns of flight, who could think like someone seeking freedom because he had once been free himself. What none of them could have known, what wouldn't be discovered for another week, was that while Solomon had tracked and captured Marcus, he had also done something else. In the Dismal Swamp, at 3 different locations along the route Marcus had taken, he had left small markers, a can of 3 stones arranged in a specific pattern, a slash mark on a particular tree, a piece of colored cloth tied to a low branch. They were signs that meant nothing to the casual observer, but everything to someone who knew how to read them. They were messages, warnings, redirections. They pointed away from the maroon settlements, away from the route Solomon knew toward paths that might possibly offer a better chance of success for the next person who ran. It was a small rebellion. It was perhaps meaningless, but it was the only thing Solomon Crowe could do to feel like something more than a tool, more than the master's hand. He was saving his children by destroying his soul piece by piece. And these small stones and secret marks were the only evidence that somewhere inside he was still fighting. In the quarters that night, the whispered conversations were bitter and afraid. The new hunter had proven his skill. The question now was whether anyone would ever make it to freedom again, or whether they were all caught in a trap with no escape, hunted by one of their own. The months that followed Marcus' capture established a pattern that would define the next 2 years of life at Fairmont Estate. Solomon Crowe became a fixture of dread, the man who appeared when someone vanished, who returned within days with his captive in tow. But the pattern was more complex than it appeared on the surface. And for those watching closely, there were inconsistencies that didn't quite add up. In September of 1839, 3 people fled together. 2 brothers named Thomas and Benjamin, field workers, and an older woman called Aunt Ruth, who knew herbal medicine and had been planning the escape for months. They left on a moonless night during a rainstorm that would wash away their scent trail, or so they thought. Solomon tracked them for 6 days, longer than usual. When he returned, he had only Thomas with him. The young man was exhausted and had a badly sprained ankle, but was otherwise unharmed. He told conflicting stories about what happened to Benjamin and Aunt Ruth, first saying they had drowned crossing a swollen creek, then claiming they had separated 3 days in, then falling silent altogether. Solomon's report to Fairmont was brief. The other 2 had reached the swamp interior and were likely lost. The master accepted this explanation, though it cost Solomon part of his promised reward. The bloodhound judge had returned with an injured paw, unable to continue the hunt. What no one knew was that on the 4th day of tracking, Solomon had caught up with all 3 of them resting in an abandoned trapper's cabin. Instead of immediately securing them, he had sat down and drawn a map in the dirt floor, showing them a route he claimed the professional catchers didn't know, a path that skirted the eastern edge of the swamp and led to a series of farms near the North Carolina border where Quaker families sometimes offered shelter. He had told them about patrol patterns, about which roads to avoid, about how to recognize safe houses. Then he had looked at Thomas's injured ankle and made a calculation. "You can't move fast enough." He had said the other 2 might make it. "You won't. I'm taking you back, and I'm telling them the others drowned." "That gives them a chance," Thomas had argued, had begged to be left behind so all 3 could go. But Aunt Ruth had understood. She had looked at Solomon with eyes that had seen 70 years of slavery's variations and said, "You're killing yourself slowly doing this. You know that, don't you? Yes. Solomon had replied, but my children get to live. They had left at dawn. Benjamin and Aunt Ruth heading east with Solomon's map memorized. Thomas returning with Solomon in chains. Whether the other two made it, Solomon never learned. He chose to believe they did. He had to believe something. In December, a young woman named Lily vanished from the main house where she worked as a chambermaid. She was 16, pregnant, and terrified that she would be sold away from her mother before the baby was born. Her trail led south toward Petersburg, and Solomon caught up with her within 2 days. She was hiding in a barn, shivering and crying, too scared to keep running, but too scared to go back. Solomon sat with her for 3 hours, talking in a voice almost too quiet to hear. He told her about his own children, about the calculations of survival, about how sometimes going back was the only way to protect the people you loved. He promised, though he had no power to keep such promises, that he would speak to Fairmont about keeping her and her mother together. Then he brought her back, and she was whipped anyway as an example. The pregnancy ended 2 weeks later. Solomon's face showed nothing when he heard, but that night, people in the quarters heard sounds coming from the small cabin where he stayed alone. Sounds that might have been weeping or might have been something else breaking. But there were also the unexplained successes. In February of 1840, a man named Samuel, who worked in the stables, simply disappeared. Solomon tracked him for a week, ranging far into the Dismal Swamp interior, and returned without him, reporting that the trail had been lost in the maze of waterways. Fairmont was furious, docking Solomon's rations and threatening consequences. A month later, 2 women who worked in the kitchen fled together. Solomon pursued for 5 days and returned alone, claiming they had reached a maroon settlement too well defended to approach safely. Fairmont's anger was becoming dangerous. These failures were costing him money and reputation. He warned Solomon that if the pattern continued, he would reconsider the arrangement about his family. What Fairmont didn't know was that Solomon had found Samuel, had spoken with him for an entire afternoon in a clearing deep in the swamp, and had told him exactly how to reach a maroon community where Solomon's own cousin lived. He had given Samuel food, a compass he claimed to have lost, and detailed instructions that would keep him alive in the swamp interior. Similarly, the 2 kitchen women had been guided to a safe route Solomon had scouted months earlier, one that led to an underground railroad station he discovered but never reported. These small acts of sabotage were Solomon's private war against his own role, his way of maintaining some fragment of humanity while serving as the instrument of oppression. But the mathematics were brutal. For every person Solomon secretly helped, he genuinely captured 3 others. For every whispered warning or hidden map, there were chains and tears and the walk back to bondage. He was keeping careful count in his forbidden journal. 94 people captured and returned. 23 people he had helped escape or led professional catches away from. 11 people he had found too late, already dead from exposure or drowning or the dozens of ways the swamp could kill. The numbers haunted him. The faces haunted him more. In the quarters, opinions about Solomon remained divided. Some saw him as purely evil, a collaborator who had sold his soul so completely that no punishment could be sufficient. Others, particularly the older ones who had survived longer in the system, understood the impossible position he occupied. Celia, who ran the Resistance Network, had the most nuanced view. She had been watching Solomon carefully for months, noting the inconsistencies, the times when his tracking took longer than it should have, the patterns of who came back and who didn't. She began to suspect that the hunter was playing a double game, but she couldn't be sure. And in a world where betrayal meant death, certainty mattered. Everything changed in March of 1840, when Fairmont finally fulfilled part of his promise. Solomon's wife, Hannah, was purchased from the neighboring plantation and brought to Fairmont. But only Hannah, the children, were to remain where they were as insurance of continued good performance. Solomon had been allowed 1 visit per month under supervision. Hannah's arrival complicated everything. She looked at Solomon with eyes that held too many emotions to name. Love and horror and understanding and condemnation all mixed together. They were given a small cabin at the edge of the quarters, separate from the others. A space that should have felt like a sanctuary, but instead felt like another cage. That first night they lay in the dark, not touching, the distance between them vast despite the narrow bed. How many? Hannah finally asked. 94. And how many did you help? The question surprised him. You knew. I'm not blind, Solomon. I've heard the stories, the ones who disappeared completely, the ones where you came back with excuses. I know you're trying to do something, but 94, Solomon, 94 people you brought back to chains. 23 I helped escape. I keep count. I have to keep count. Does the counting make it better? He had no answer for that. After a long silence, Hannah spoke again, her voice barely audible. Mercy asks about you every time I see her. She's forgetting what you look like. Isaac doesn't remember you at all. Are we saving them, or are we just teaching them that survival means becoming what you hate? The question hung in the darkness unanswerable. Outside, a spring rain began to fall, the sound almost gentle against the cabin roof. Inside, two people who had once loved each other tried to figure out how to live with what survival had cost them. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Solomon Crowe's story intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. What neither of them could have known that night was that Celia was making her own calculations. She had watched Solomon's reunion with his wife, had seen the way they moved around each other like ghosts. She had gathered enough evidence of his double game to be reasonably certain he wasn't purely an enemy. And she was about to make the most dangerous bet of her life. She was going to approach Solomon Crowe and offer him a chance at real redemption because the network's planned escape was now scheduled for April 15th. 35 people moving together. The largest coordinated escape attempt in Tidewater, Virginia history. And they needed help from someone who knew how the hunters thought, someone who could tell them what to avoid and where to go. They needed Solomon Crowe to decide once and for all which side he was really on. The approach happened on a Wednesday morning in early April, when Solomon was checking traps he had set in the woods north of the plantation. Celia appeared on the path ahead of him, as if she'd materialized from the morning mist, her presence startling Judge enough that the dog barked once before settling. Solomon's hand went instinctively to the knife at his belt, then stopped. Celia was alone, unarmed, and her posture communicated something other than threat. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, "and you need to decide who you actually are." Solomon's face remained impassive, but his mind was racing through calculations. Celia ran the underground network. He'd known that for months had deliberately avoided learning details that might force him to report her. Her approaching him directly meant something had changed. Some threshold had been crossed. "I'm exactly who I appear to be," he said carefully, "the man who brings people back." "Are you?" "Because I've been keeping count too, Solomon Crowe. I know about the 3 people you tracked for a week when you could have found them in 2 days. I know about the routes you've marked in the swamp, the cans of stones that point away from where you claim people went. I know about your cousin in the Maroon settlement, the one you've never mentioned to Fairmont. I know, and I'm betting my life that I'm right about what it means." The silence stretched between them measured in heartbeats. The judge sat at Solomon's feet, looking between the two humans as if trying to understand what was happening. Finally, Solomon spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you're wrong, I could have you in chains within an hour. Fairmont would reward me well for exposing the network leader, but you won't because I'm not wrong." Celia stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "We're planning something big. 35 people all moving together on April 15th. We need to know what the hunters will do, where they'll focus their search, what routes to avoid. We need your knowledge, and you need a chance to do something that matters, something that might let you look at yourself without wanting to die." Solomon closed his eyes, and for the first time since he'd been brought to Fairmont, his careful mask cracked. "They have my children, If I help you and it's discovered, Mercy and Isaac will be sold to Louisiana. They'll die in the cane fields before they turn 12. That's not metaphor, that's mathematics. Child mortality on sugar plantations is 60% in the first 2 years. I know, and that's why we're offering you a different calculation. Celia pulled a small piece of paper from her dress pocket, unfolded it, and showed Solomon a hand-drawn map. This is the route we're planning, but we're also arranging something else. On April 13th, 2 days before the main escape, a sympathetic merchant is taking a wagon north to Pennsylvania. There's room for 3 people hidden in a false bottom. He's willing to take your family. Solomon's breath caught. How? The plantation where your children are held has a kitchen garden supervisor who's part of the network. She can get them out the night before the wagon leaves. Your wife is already here. If you help us, all 3 of them leave 2 days before anyone even knows something's wrong. By the time Fairmont realizes you've betrayed him, they'll be crossing into Pennsylvania. And me, you stay, you track us, but you track us wrong. You lead the search parties in circles away from where we're actually going. You buy us time, maybe 3 days, maybe 4. Then you run 2 heading west instead of north, making them think that's where everyone went. Or you stay and face the consequences. I won't lie to you about what that means. Either way, your family is safe. Solomon's mind was spinning through the possibilities, the risks, the likelihood of success. 35 people moving together was madness. Too many, too visible, too easy to track. But if he was the one doing the tracking, he could make mistakes, could follow false trails, could interpret signs wrong. He could give them a chance. Why should I trust you? This could be a test, a way for Fairmont to prove my disloyalty. Because I'm putting my life in your hands right now by having this conversation. Because you've been playing both sides for 2 years and I'm betting you're tired of it. Because 35 people are leaving whether you help or not. And this is your chance to make sure they succeed instead of just watching them get slaughtered. Celia's voice softened slightly. I've seen you with your wife, Solomon. I've seen your face when you bring people back. You're dying inside, piece by piece. This is your chance to choose something different. The decision should have been impossible, but somehow it wasn't. Solomon had been waiting for something like this, some opportunity to tip the balance of his terrible mathematics in a different direction. He had saved 23 people while condemning 94. What if he could reverse those numbers? What if he could use everything he'd learned, all the knowledge he'd accumulated to actually serve the cause of freedom instead of bondage? I need details, he said finally. Everything, routes, timing, who's going in which group, what signals you're using. If I'm going to do this, I have to know enough to lead the search wrong. Over the next hour, hidden in the woods with Judge standing watch, Celia laid out the entire plan. The 35 people would split into 3 groups after the initial departure, taking different routes that would converge at a meeting point 40 miles north in North Carolina. They had supplies cached along the way, contacts with Underground Railroad conductors, and a detailed timeline. The escape was scheduled for the night of April 15th, starting at midnight when the moon would be dark and the patrol schedules were lightest. Solomon listened, memorized, and began to see the weaknesses in their plan, points where professional trackers would narrow the search, routes that would leave too obvious a trail, places where the groups were vulnerable to interception. He started asking questions, offering modifications, his strategic mind engaging fully for the first time in service of freedom rather than bondage. By the time they finished, the plan had evolved into something with a real chance of success. One more thing, Solomon said as they prepared to separate. When I lead the search wrong, I have to make it look convincing. That means I might have to capture someone. It has to be someone strong enough to withstand interrogation. Someone who can maintain the lie about where everyone else went. I'm volunteering myself. If we can arrange for me to catch someone from one of the groups who will claim the others went west when they actually went north, it'll redirect the entire search. Celia studied him with new respect. You're planning your own capture. I'm planning to save my family and give 35 people a chance at freedom. Whatever that requires is what I'll do. He paused, then added, I've spent 2 years being the monster. I'd like to spend my last 3 days being something else." They separated carefully, Celia heading back toward the quarters, Solomon continuing his checking routine as if nothing had happened. Judge looked up at him with what might have been confusion or might have been understanding. For the first time in years, Solomon felt something like hope, though it was mixed with terror at the magnitude of what he'd agreed to do. That night, he told Hannah everything. She listened in silence, her face passing through shock, fear, and finally something that looked like relief. "So we might actually make it out," she said quietly. "All of us. You and the children will. I'll follow when I can or I won't. But you'll be free, Hannah. That's what matters." She took his hand, the first time she'd voluntarily touched him in months. "No, what matters is that you finally chose right. Whatever happens next, you chose right." The next days were a carefully choreographed performance. Solomon continued his regular routines, checked in with Fairmont, maintained his cover as the reliable hunter. But at night, he met with members of the network, refining escape routes, teaching them what signs to hide and which to leave as false trails. He drew detailed maps of the swamp interior from memory, marking safe paths and dangerous ones. He explained how tracking dogs worked and how to defeat them where patrols focused their attention, what mistakes most fugitives made. He shared everything he knew, holding nothing back. On April 13th, as planned, Solomon's children were smuggled out of their plantation in the dead of night. Hidden among sacks of grain in a kitchen wagon, they were transferred to the merchant's wagon the next morning, concealed in the false bottom along with Hannah. Solomon saw them off in the pre-dawn darkness, holding his children for the first time in 2 years. Mercy, taller now, serious-faced and quiet. Isaac, shy and clinging to his mother. They didn't know him well enough to fully trust him, but Hannah whispered to them that he was their father and he loved them, and that would have to be enough. "You'll come?" Mercy asked, her voice small. "I'll come," Solomon promised, knowing it might be a lie, but needing to give her something. "I'll find you no matter what." The wagon rolled away into the darkness, heading north with cargo more precious than any merchant goods. Solomon stood watching until it disappeared, then turned back toward Fairmont Estate. He had one more day to prepare, one more day to finalize the details of his betrayal and his redemption. April 15th arrived with unseasonably warm weather, the air thick with the promise of spring storms. Solomon went through his daily routines with mechanical precision, knowing that by midnight everything would change. In the quarters, 35 people prepared for the most dangerous night of their lives, checking supplies, reviewing instructions, saying silent goodbyes to those too old or too young or too afraid to make the journey. Celia moved among them, calm and focused, making last-minute adjustments. Abel, the blacksmith, distributed tools and weapons just in case. The network they'd built over years was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. As the sun set, Solomon sat in his cabin and opened his forbidden journal one last time. He read through the names. 94 people captured, 23 people secretly helped, 11 people found. Too late. Tomorrow. If everything went according to plan, he would add 35 more names to the ledger, but this time in a column labeled freed. It wouldn't balance the scales. Nothing could balance those scales, but it was something. It was a choice. It was the last thing he could do that might matter. At 11:45 p.m., he heard the first sounds of movement from the quarters. The escape was beginning. In 6 hours, when the morning horn blew and people didn't appear for work, alarm would be raised. By then, the escapees would have a significant head start, and Solomon Crowe would begin the most important performance of his life. The hunt that he would deliberately botch, leading the searchers away while his people ran toward freedom. He tucked the journal into his shirt, put on his tracking gear, and sat down to wait for the inevitable summons. Judge lay at his feet, sensing something was different, but unable to understand what. Outside, the moon rose dark and new, perfect cover for those moving through the night toward a freedom they might actually impossibly reach. The alarm went off at dawn earlier than expected. An overseer making an unusual early round had noticed the quarters too quiet, had investigated, and had discovered the mass absence. Within minutes, Fairmont's estate erupted in chaos. Bells rang. Riders went out in all directions, and Solomon was summoned to the main house with an urgency that bordered on panic. Fairmont met him on the front porch, his face purple with rage and fear. 35, he spat. 35 of my property vanished in the night. How is that even possible? Where were the patrols? Where were the watchers? He grabbed Solomon by the shirt. You're supposed to prevent this. You're supposed to know when something like this is being planned. Solomon maintained his mask of controlled concern. 35, that's not a random escape. That's organized. Someone's been planning this for months. He let appropriate worry show on his face. Get me judge and provisions. If they left at midnight, they have 6 hours on us, but 35 people moving together will leave a trail. I can find them. Within the hour, a hunting party was assembled. Solomon and Judge, 4 professional slave catchers Fairmont had sent for, 3 overseers and a dozen dogs. They started at the quarters, Judge immediately picking up a scent trail heading northeast toward the Entoway River. The professional catchers nodded approvingly. It was the expected route, the one most fugitives took. What they didn't notice was the almost imperceptible hesitation in Solomon's posture, the way his eyes tracked signs the dogs missed, the careful mental calculations he was making. The trail led exactly where Solomon had told it to lead toward a creek crossing 3 miles north where the groups had split up according to plan. But here's where his expertise became crucial. The real trail split 3 ways. One group heading northwest toward Richmond, one northeast toward the Dismal Swamp, and one due north along a carefully scouted route. Solomon studied the signs, reading a story written specifically for him to misinterpret, and made his first strategic mistake. They've split up, he announced, pointing toward marks he claimed to see, but the main group went west toward the Appomattox River. See these broken branches? That's 15, maybe 20 people moving fast. The others are decoys, smaller groups meant to divide our attention. The lead catcher, a grizzled man named Hutchkins with a reputation for brutality, studied the ground and nodded. Makes sense. They're trying to reach the mountains, put distance between themselves and the plantations. If they make it to the highlands, they could disappear into the hill country. He looked at Solomon with grudging respect. You've got a good eye, boy. The hunting party split. Most of the men and dogs went west following Solomon's false reading, while 2 catchers went northeast as a precaution. Solomon went with the main group, leading them on a trail that existed but hadn't been used by the actual fugitives. He moved confidently, pointing out signs, keeping Judge on task, playing the role of expert tracker, while internally praying that the real groups were making good time on their actual routes. For 2 days, Solomon led the hunting party in circles through the Virginia countryside west of Petersburg. He found traces of passage, broken vegetation, disturbed earth, even old campfire sites that he claimed were from the fugitives, but were actually from travelers or hunters from weeks prior. He kept the pace brisk enough to seem urgent, but not so fast that the men didn't tire. He maneuvered them into difficult terrain that slowed progress. He lost the trail twice, requiring hours of searching to pick it up again. The professional catchers grew frustrated, but couldn't fault his effort or his tracking skill. He was doing everything right, it seemed, and yet somehow the fugitives remained ahead of them. But on the morning of the 3rd day, everything started to unravel. A rider caught up with the hunting party bringing news. One of the groups had been spotted near Suffolk, 40 miles northeast, the opposite direction from where Solomon had led them. 3 people had been captured trying to cross into North Carolina. Under interrogation, they had claimed the others were heading west, but their capture location told a different story. Hutchkins looked at Solomon with suspicion blooming in his eyes. You said they went west. You were certain. Solomon maintained his composure, thinking fast. 35 people, remember? What if they split more than 3 ways? What if some went west and others went north? We could both be right. But his voice carried a note of doubt. He didn't have to fake. 3 captured meant 32 still free, but it also meant the hunters were reassessing, getting smarter, potentially discovering the real routes. The party turned northeast, moving with renewed purpose. Solomon's window for leading them wrong was closing. They reached Suffolk by nightfall, and there the captured 3 were being held. A young man named David, a woman called Sarah, and an older man everyone knew as Uncle Tom. All 3 had been severely beaten during capture, but they maintained their story. The others had gone west. They were lying to protect the reals, just as planned, but their interrogators were skilled at reading pain and deception. Solomon was brought to see them, Fairmont insisting that he might recognize signs of deception the white catchers would miss. He found them in a tobacco barn, chained and bloody, Sarah's face swollen nearly shut, David's arm hanging at an unnatural angle. Uncle Tom looked at Solomon with eyes that held no accusation. He knew the plan, knew Solomon's role, and was playing his part despite the cost. They went west, he repeated when questioned again, toward the mountains. That's all I know. But Hutchkins wasn't satisfied. He pulled Solomon aside, voice low and dangerous. Something doesn't add up. You're the best tracker Fairmont's ever had. Perfect record. But now you lead us on a 3-day chase that goes nowhere, and we find fugitives in the completely opposite direction. Either you've suddenly gotten terrible at your job, or you've been lying to us. This was the moment Solomon had both planned for and dreaded. He met Hutchkins's eyes steadily. Then maybe you should track them yourself instead of relying on a slave to do your job. I read the signs I saw. If they're wrong, blame your own instincts for trusting me. The response was calculated, defiant enough to seem genuine, but not so defiant as to get him killed immediately. Hutchkins's hand went to his whip, but Fairmont intervened. We don't have time for this. Solomon, you're going to track the actual trail now, the one leading north from where those 3 were captured. And if you make another mistake, you'll be in chains. Next to them, understood. Solomon nodded, his mind racing. The captured 3 had bought time, 3 days during which the main groups had been moving steadily north. But now the hunt was refocusing, and Solomon's ability to sabotage it was gone. Worse, the hunters were angry, frustrated, and increasingly suspicious of him. His own capture, which he'd planned as a way to further misdirect the search, was coming sooner than anticipated and not on his terms. They picked up the trail northeast of Suffolk at dawn on the 4th day. This time Solomon couldn't pretend to read it wrong. There were too many other trackers checking his work, too many eyes watching him. The trail led through dense forest toward the Dismal Swamp, signs of a large group moving with reasonable care but inevitable sloppiness when numbers were this large. Judge pulled at the lead with renewed enthusiasm. Scent fresh and strong, they were perhaps 12 hours behind now, maybe less. Solomon did what he could, working small sabotages into the tracking, pausing to examine false leads, suggesting routes that added miles to the pursuit, claiming uncertainty when the trail was actually clear. But each delay was scrutinized, each hesitation questioned. Hutchkins kept close to him now, watching everything he did. The other hunters sensed the tension and grew more vigilant. The net was tightening not just around the fugitives, but around Solomon himself. On the 5th day, they found evidence of campsite, fire rings, discarded food, clear signs of a large group resting. Hutchkins examined it closely and announced they were now only 6 hours behind. We'll catch them by tomorrow, he said with certainty. They can't maintain this pace with children and old people in the group. Solomon felt ice in his stomach. 5 days of freedom for 32 people, not enough. Not nearly enough to reach Pennsylvania or even safe stations in North Carolina. They needed more time, but he had no more tricks left to play. That night, as the hunting party camped, he lay awake, calculating distances and possibilities. The fugitives had planned for 7 to 10 days of travel to reach the first major safe station. They were only 5 days in. The mathematics were brutal, and then came the moment that changed everything. Solomon woke before dawn to find Hutchkins standing over him, pistol, other hunters surrounding the camp. I've been thinking, Hutchkins said conversationally, about how convenient it was that this escape happened right after your wife was brought to Fairmont, about how you've been making mistakes you never made before, about how you kept insisting they went west when everything else said north. And then I remembered something. There was a wagon that left 2 days before the escape, heading north, merchant named Patterson. I sent a rider to check, and guess what? Patterson's wagon had a false bottom, and in that false bottom, hidden under his cargo, were your 2 children. They made it to Pennsylvania, Solomon. They're safe. Solomon's blood turned to ice. His face showed nothing, but his mind was screaming. They knew everything. I don't know what you're talking about, he said carefully. No. Well, it doesn't matter much now. Your family's gone beyond our reach. But you're still here, and you're going to help us catch these runaways properly, or you're going to watch while we make an example of every single one we catch, your choice. Do your job like you used to, or add 32 deaths to your conscience. The other hunters watched Solomon, weapons ready. He was trapped, his options eliminated. His family was safe. That knowledge should have been a relief, but instead it felt like a weight, because now these men would use every captured fugitive as leverage, would torture and kill to punish his betrayal, and he would be forced to witness it all. Solomon looked at Hutchkins, at the armed men surrounding him, and made his final calculation. No, he said simply, No, no, I won't help you anymore. My family is free. That's what matters. You can kill me or chain me, but I won't lead you to them. Hutchkins smiled, a cold expression without humor. That's what I thought you'd say, which is why we're going to do this a different way. You're going to run, Solomon, right now. You're going to run north, following the same trail they did, and we're going to track you. You'll lead us right to them without meaning to, because you'll be trying to reach them yourself to warn them. It's perfect. The great hunter becomes the bait. Solomon realized with horror that it was brilliant. If he ran, he would instinctively follow the routes he'd helped plan, would head toward the meeting points and safe stations, would lead the hunters directly to the people he'd tried to save. If he refused to run, they would torture him until he broke or died, and either way the hunt would continue. There was no good choice, no clever play left to make. Run, Hutchkins said, cocking his pistol. Or die right here, your choice. Solomon ran. He ran north into the Preed, on darkness, his mind desperately seeking solutions that didn't exist. Behind him, he heard the hunters mounting up, heard Judge baying as the bloodhound picked up his scent. He had become what he'd always been, the tool of the hunters, leading them to their prey. Except now the prey included everyone he'd tried to save, and the tool was being used against his will. The irony was devastating. He'd spent 2 years tracking his own people while secretly trying to help them, maintaining a terrible balance between survival and resistance. Now, in his moment of rebellion, he'd become a more effective weapon for the hunters than he'd ever been when he was cooperating. His very attempt to escape would betray everyone he loved. As the sun rose behind him and the sounds of pursuit drew closer, Solomon Crowe understood that he had finally run out of calculations, out of compromises, out of ways to serve two masters. The only question left was what kind of man he would be in his final hours, the hunter or the hunted, the betrayer or the betrayed, and that choice at least was finally his own. Solomon ran for 6 hours before he made his decision. The hunting party stayed close enough behind that he could hear them, close enough that Judge's barking never faded, far enough that he had time to think. They were letting him run, following his trail, betting that panic and desperation would lead him straight to the other fugitives. And they were right. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to reach the nearest meeting point, to warn the others, to use his knowledge to help them escape. But Solomon Crowe had been playing chess with impossible stakes for 2 years. He knew how to think several moves ahead, even when all the moves were bad. And he understood that sometimes the only winning move was to sacrifice yourself completely. At midday, he reached a section of swamp he knew intimately, a maze of waterways and false islands that looked like solid ground, but would swallow anyone who trusted appearances. He had brought 3 people back from this area over the years, and had always navigated it with extreme care. Now he plunged into it with seeming recklessness, his trail obvious and easy to follow. He wanted the hunters confident, wanted them moving fast, wanted them to think he was making mistakes born of exhaustion and fear. The landscape became increasingly treacherous. Black water disguised by floating vegetation, quicksand-like mud, cypress knees that could trip and trap the unwary. Solomon moved through it with the sureness of someone who had memorized every safe path and every deadly one. Behind him, the hunters followed, their tracking dogs, pulling them forward along Solomon's clear trail. Then Solomon did something that would have seemed insane to anyone watching. He climbed a massive fallen cypress tree that bridged a stretch of black water, walked to its center, and stopped. He turned to face his pursuers as they emerged from the tree-line. Hutchkins in front, 4 other hunters spreading out, Judge straining at his leash. They had him cornered, or so they thought. "That's far enough," Solomon called out, his voice carrying across the swamp. "You want to know where the others are? I'll tell you. They split into 4 groups, not 3. 1 went west, like I said. That wasn't completely a lie. 2 went north through the swamp on routes I scouted. The 4th went east to the coast, planning to stow away on ships. They had a week's head start on the routes I showed them. Even if you turn back now and search every direction, you won't catch them in time." Hutchins dismounted, walking carefully onto the log bridge. "That's a good story, Solomon. But I think you're going to tell us exactly which routes and exactly which ships after we persuade you properly." "No," Solomon said. "I won't, because I'm done being your tool, done making calculations about whose life matters more. I spent 2 years as the monster you needed me to be, and I'm not doing it anymore. Then you'll die here." "Yes, but not before I show you one last thing about this swamp." Solomon looked down at the black water beneath him. "See this? Looks like solid ground covered in moss. It's not. It's floating vegetation over water 15 ft deep. And below that is mud that doesn't let go. The cypresses around us look like they're growing from islands. They're not. They're rooted in mud beneath the water, the only solid ground for 200 yd in any direction is this log and the path I took to get here." Hutchinson's face changed as he understood. "You led us into a trap. I led you exactly where you wanted to go, following me. The question is whether you can follow me back out." Solomon smiled without humor. "See, I've been through this area a dozen times. I know every safe step, every stable piece of ground, every path that won't kill you, and I'm the only one who does." One of the hunters behind Hutchins stepped off the path, testing what looked like solid earth. His foot sank immediately, and he had to be pulled back by his companions, his leg coated in black mud up to the knee. Another tried to circle around on what appeared to be a different route, and found himself suddenly waist deep in cold water, thrashing as his feet found no bottom. The dogs, sensing the danger, whined and pulled backward. "You're bluffing," Hutchins said, but his voice held uncertainty. "You'll show us the way out to save yourself." "Will I?" Solomon sat down on the log, straddling it completely at ease. "My family is free, Hutchins. My wife, my children, they're beyond your reach. That was the only calculation that mattered. Everything else, everything I've done for 2 years, everyone I've captured, all the compromises I've made, that was just the cost of keeping them alive. But the debt's paid now. I'm free too. Maybe not the way I'd hoped, but free nonetheless. I don't owe anyone anything anymore." The hunters conferred in low voices, looking at the treacherous landscape surrounding them, at Solomon's calm face, at the lengthening shadows as afternoon moved toward evening. They were trapped, but so was he. It was a stalemate that could only end one way. Hutchins made his choice. He raised his pistol, aiming at Solomon. "Then you'll die, and we'll find our own way out. These swamps can't be as dangerous as you claim. They're exactly as dangerous as I claim, but you're welcome to test that theory." Solomon's voice carried no fear, only a strange peace. "Shoot me if you want, but when you do, you lose the only person who knows which way is safe, and night falls fast in the swamp. The sounds you'll hear after dark, the screams that sound human but come from animals, the lights that look like lanterns but lead you nowhere, the things that move through the black water, those are real. I've seen men die out here from fear alone. Watch them make stupid decisions because they couldn't handle one night in the dark. The standoff stretched, tension thick as the swamp air. Then Hutchins made an unexpected move. He holstered his pistol and sat down on the log 20 ft from Solomon. "Tell me something," he said conversationally. "Was it worth it becoming what you became, hunting your own people?" Solomon considered the question seriously. "I saved my children. That was worth anything, everything else. Every person I brought back in chains, that's a debt I'll carry forever. But my daughter Mercy is alive and free. My son Isaac will grow up in Pennsylvania never knowing bondage. If my soul's the price for that, so be it. 94 people. Solomon, I heard Fairmont bragging about your record. 94 human beings you condemned to continue in slavery. 23 I helped escape. You didn't know about those. 11 more I found too late, already dead or beyond help. But 23 made it because I pointed them the right way, gave them supplies, taught them what to avoid, and now 32 more have a chance because I led you in circles for 5 days." Solomon's voice was steady. "The mathematics don't balance, they never will, but I did what I could with the choices I had." Hutchins laughed bitterly. "You're a piece of work, Solomon Crowe, a monster with a conscience. I don't know if that makes you better or worse than the rest of us." "Neither do I," Solomon admitted, "but I'm done trying to figure it out." The sun sank lower, shadows lengthening. The other hunters were getting nervous. Their horses sensing the terrain's instability and becoming difficult to control, Judge Wed constantly now pulling away from the water, the swamp was waking up for night. The calls of herons, the splash of something large moving through unseen channels, the buzz of insects that would make darkness unbearable. "Last chance," Hutchins said. "Show us out and we'll let you go. Just walk away, disappear into the swamp, and we'll forget we ever saw you." It was a lie, obviously, but Solomon appreciated the attempt. "If I believed that, would it matter? I'm not going back, Hutchins, not to Fairmont, not to being the hunter, not to any of it. This is where my story ends. Then we're stuck here together. No, you can go back the exact way you came. Follow your own trail backward. It'll take you until full dark to reach solid ground, but you'll make it if you don't deviate from the path." I marked it carefully. Broken branches, disturbed mud, all the signs a good tracker would notice. "Trust your own skills and you'll survive." Hutchins stared at him. "You're giving us an out after everything. I'm not the monster you need me to be. Never was. Not completely." Solomon looked up at the darkening sky, at the first stars appearing through the cypress canopy. "Besides, what would it accomplish to kill you here? You're not the system. You're just another tool, same as I was. The real evil is back at those plantations, built into the laws, written into the deeds and bills of sale. Killing you changes nothing." The hunter was silent for a long time. Then he stood, called to his men, and began the careful process of reversing their trail. They moved slowly, testing each step, following the signs Solomon had left. As they disappeared into the gathering dusk, Hutchins called back one final time. "They'll send others, you know, more hunters, better ones. Let them come." Solomon replied, "By the time they find me, if they find me, the others will be long gone. That's all that matters." He sat alone on the log as full darkness fell, listening to the swamp come alive around him. He thought about Hannah and Mercy and Isaac, hopefully safe in Pennsylvania by now. He thought about the 32 people still moving north, putting miles between themselves and bondage with every hour. He thought about the 94 he'd failed, the 23 he'd saved, the impossible mathematics of his life. The journal was still in his shirt. In the last light, he pulled it out and wrote one final entry. "April 20th, 1840, in the Dismal Swamp. My family is free. 32 others have a chance. I am done hunting. Whatever happens next, I chose this. For the first time in years, I chose." He sat through the night, and when dawn came, he was still there, alone with the black water and the cypress trees and the sound of his own breathing. The hunting party didn't return. They had made it out and would undoubtedly bring reinforcements, but they would need days to organize, days to gather more men and dogs, days to convince anyone to venture deep into the swamp where Solomon had led them, days that 32 people could use to reach freedom. Solomon Crowe didn't know what would happen next. He might find his way to Pennsylvania eventually, might reunite with his family, might build something new from the ruins of what he'd been forced to become, or he might die in this swamp, alone and unfound, his body feeding the same black water that had hidden so many others. But for the first time since he'd been stolen from his free life in Delaware 20 years ago, the choice was his. He was no longer the master's tool, no longer the hunter forced to pursue his own people. He was just a man sitting in a swamp, having finally stopped running from himself, and in the ledgers back at Fairmont Estate, in the margins where his name appeared 17 times, someone would eventually write a final entry. It would say simply, "Solomon Crowe, property of Richard Fairmont, absconded April 1840, never recovered." But the real story, the story of 94 captures and 23 escapes, of impossible choices and small rebellions, of a man who became the monster to save his family and then chose to stop being that monster, even though it cost him everything. That story was written only in his forbidden journal, and in the freedom of those who made it north because of the days he bought them. The hunting party that eventually entered the swamp 3 days later found Solomon's log bridge and the treacherous maze of black water surrounding it. They found evidence of his presence, marks on the cypress, a few signs of temporary camping, but they didn't find Solomon himself. He had vanished into the swamp's interior, either dead or disappeared into one of the maroon communities that the hunters could never quite reach. Fairmont offered a reward of $500 for his capture, but no one collected it. Solomon Crowe had become a ghost talked about in whispers, a cautionary tale about what happens when the system's tools turn against their purpose. What the hunters never found was the journal. Solomon had buried it in a waterproof oil-skinned pouch on a small island he knew about, marked only by a car of 3 stones that meant nothing to anyone else. Years later, during the Civil War, when Union troops swept through Virginia and the plantation system collapsed, a young corporal from Massachusetts would find it. He would read it cover to cover, stunned by the meticulous record of captures and escapes, the detailed accounting of one man's attempt to balance impossible mathematics. The journal would eventually end up in a private collection in Boston, where it would rest for another century before being donated to a historical society that barely knew what to do with it. Of the 32 people who escaped from Fairmont Estate that April night, 28 made it to freedom. 4 were recaptured in North Carolina when a sympathetic station master turned informant for reward money. But the 28 reached Pennsylvania, then scattered, some to New York, some to Canada, some to Ohio and Massachusetts. They built lives, raised families, and told their children about the escape, though the details varied. Some remembered Solomon Crowe as a traitor who had hunted them before finally choosing the right side. Others remembered him as a hero who had sacrificed everything to give them a chance. Both versions were true. Hannah and the children settled in Philadelphia. She worked as a seamstress, saved what money she could, and waited for word of Solomon that never came. Mercy grew up to become a teacher in a school for black children, and Isaac became a conductor on the Underground Railroad himself, helping others make the same journey his family had made. They told their children about their father, though the story grew hazier with each telling. Eventually, Solomon Crowe became more legend than memory, the man who had been both hunter and liberator, who had served the system that enslaved him until finally choosing something else. In the years that followed, other enslaved people forced into similar roles would hear whispered stories about Solomon Crowe. They would learn that he had kept his own records, had found ways to help, even while appearing to hurt, had ultimately chosen freedom over survival when the two could no longer coexist. For some, the story offered hope that even compromised resistance was still resistance. For others, it was a reminder that the system was designed to corrupt everything it touched, to turn victims into accomplices, to make every choice a losing one. Both interpretations were correct. Fairmont Estate declined steadily after the mass escape. The loss of 35 people, nearly 20% of his enslaved population, was a financial blow Richard Fairmont never recovered from. Other enslaved people, emboldened by the successful escape, began to flee with greater frequency. The plantation's reputation suffered. Buyers were reluctant to purchase a place with such notorious instability. By 1847, Fairmont was forced to sell, his debts finally overwhelming him. The plantation was broken up and sold piecemeal. The remaining enslaved people scattered to other estates. The ledgers containing Solomon's name were boxed and stored, eventually ending up in a county court.